Chapter 1. An unexpected delivery. Rain pounded against the windows of Blackwood Manor as if determined to breach the ancient stone walls. Duke Alexander Harrington, the 7th Duke of Westmoreland, stood before the massive hearth in his study, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand as he stared into the flames. The crackling fire did little to warm the chill that had settled in his bones these past 18 months, ever since Eleanor had been laid to rest in the family crypt alongside the child she had died trying to bring into the world. At 34, Alexander had resigned himself to a life of solitude and duty. The title demanded an heir, but he had no heart to seek another wife. How could any woman compare to Eleanor, with her quick wit and gentle spirit? Better to let the dukedom pass to his cousin's line than to enter a loveless marriage for the sake of succession. A sudden hammering at the manor's front door pulled him from his dark thoughts. Who would be calling at Blackwood at this ungodly hour, and in such weather? He heard Phillips, his butler, hurrying through the grand entrance hall, followed by the creak of the heavy oak door opening. Muffled voices drifted down the corridor, but Alexander couldn't make out the words over the storm's howl. Then came the sound of the door closing, followed by Phillips's hurried footsteps. "Your Grace!" The butler appeared at the study door, his usually composed face flushed with agitation. "I apologize for the interruption, but that is to say, you're needed in the entrance hall immediately." Alexander set down his glass with a frown. "What is it, Phillips? Who called at this hour?" "No one, Your Grace." "That is, no one remained. But someone has been left at our doorstep." Intrigued despite himself, Alexander followed his butler to the entrance hall. There, beside the door, stood Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, her grey hair escaping its usual tidy bun as she knelt beside a large covered basket. And from that basket came a sound that stopped Alexander in his tracks, the unmistakable wail of an infant. "What in God's name?" he breathed, crossing the marble floor in long strides. Mrs. Winters looked up, her weathered face a mix of concern and wonder. "A baby, Your Grace, left on our doorstep with nothing but this." She held up a folded piece of paper, already extending it toward him. Alexander took the note with fingers that suddenly felt numb. The paper was cheap, the handwriting cramped and hurried, partially smudged by raindrops that had fallen before the basket had been fully covered. "To His Grace, the Duke of Westmoreland, this child is yours by right and blood. Her mother is gone, now taken by the same fever that nearly claimed this little one. Before she died, she made me swear to bring the child to her father. You may not remember Catherine Howard from your time in London after your military service, but she never forgot you. The child's name is Rose, born on the 5th of April. Do right by her, Your Grace. She has no one else." The note was unsigned, leaving Alexander staring at the paper in disbelief. Catherine Howard? He struggled to place the name, his mind racing. Through memories of those dark months after returning from the Peninsular War, before he had met Eleanor. He had been a different man then, bitter, angry, drowning his nightmares in whiskey and whatever distractions London could offer a wounded war hero with a newly inherited title. There had been women, yes, too many to count, their faces blurring, together in the haze of grief and pain that had engulfed him then. "Your Grace?" Mrs. Winters's voice pulled him back to the present. "What shall we do?" Alexander looked down at the basket, where the infant's cries had softened to whimpering. With hesitant hands, he pulled back the damp woolen blanket to reveal a tiny face, framed by wisps of dark hair. The baby blinked up at him with eyes of startling blue, Harrington blue, the exact shade that stared back at him from every family. "Portrait in the Long Gallery! Good heavens," whispered Mrs. Winters, who had served the Harrington family for 3 generations. "She has your eyes, Your Grace, the family eyes." Something shifted in Alexander's chest as he gazed at the child, something he had thought long buried alongside Eleanor and their stillborn son. Without conscious thought, he found himself reaching into the basket, lifting the small bundle into his arms. The baby squirmed, her tiny face scrunching in protest at being disturbed, then settled against his chest. She couldn't be more than a few months old, still so impossibly small and fragile. Yet the weight of her in his arms felt strangely right, as if a piece he hadn't known was missing had suddenly slotted into place. "Guess you're my family now," he whispered, the words emerging, unbidden as the child's tiny fingers curled reflexively around his much larger one. "Your Grace?" Phillips hovered uncertainly nearby. "Should I send for the authorities? The parish might arrange for—" "No." Alexander's response was immediate and firm. "No authorities. No parish." He looked up at his two most trusted servants, his decision crystallizing with each passing moment. "If this child is mine, and it seems likely that she is, then her place is here at Blackwood." Mrs. Winter's face softened with something like approval. "The nursery has been closed up since, well, for some time, but it can be made ready quickly enough, and we'll need to find a wet nurse in the village." Alexander nodded, his mind already racing with all that would need to be arranged. "See to it, Mrs. Winters, and Phillips, send for Dr. Graham first thing tomorrow. I want the child examined to ensure she's in good health. And her name, Your Grace?" asked the housekeeper. "The note mentioned Rose," Alexander said, looking down at the now sleeping infant in his arms. "Her name is Rose Harrington." As his servants hurried off to make the necessary arrangements, Alexander remained in the entrance hall, transfixed by the tiny life he held. The rational part of his mind knew there would be scandal, questions, whispers throughout society when word spread that the widowed Duke of Westmoreland had suddenly acquired an infant daughter of mysterious origins. But looking down at Rose's sleeping face, he found he didn't care. After 18 months of hollow existence, moving through life like a ghost in his own home, here was someone real. A reason to step out of the shadows of grief. "It seems we've both been left behind by those who should have stayed," he murmured to the sleeping child. "Perhaps we can learn to go forward together." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the ancient walls of Blackwood Manor, something long dormant had begun to stir back to life in the heart of the Duke of Westmoreland. Word travelled fast in the small village of Westmoreland. By noon the following day, 3 potential wet nurses had presented themselves at Blackwood Manor, each vouched for by Dr. Graham, who had arrived promptly at first light to examine the infant. She appears to be approximately 3 months old, and despite her journey in remarkably good health, the doctor informed Alexander as they stood in the hastily prepared nursery. "A touch underweight, perhaps, but nothing that proper care won't remedy." Alexander nodded, watching as Mrs. Winters and the newly hired wet nurse, a young widow named Mary Simmons, whose own baby had died just weeks earlier, settled little, rose into the ornate cradle that had held generations of Harrington children. "And the resemblance?" Alexander asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. He had spent hours the previous night simply studying the child's face, searching for his own features reflected in her tiny visage. Dr. Graham, who had attended the Harrington family for decades, adjusted his spectacles with a small smile. "Unmistakable. Your Grace, she has the Harrington eyes, certainly, and I believe her chin and brow will favor yours as she grows. I would stake my professional reputation on her parentage." A strange mix of emotions swept through Alexander. Relief, pride, and a lingering disbelief that life could change so dramatically in a single night. "Thank you, Doctor. Your discretion in this matter is appreciated." "Of course, Your Grace. Though if I may—" The older man hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Speculation in the village is inevitable. It might be wise to develop a narrative that explains the child's presence. You mean a lie? Alexander raised an eyebrow. I mean a story that protects both you and the child from unnecessary scandal, the doctor replied diplomatically. Perhaps a distant relative's orphaned child taken in out of family duty? Alexander considered this, watching as Rose's tiny fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. No, he said finally. No more secrets. Rose is my daughter. The circumstances of her arrival are unusual, but the truth is simpler than any fiction we might create. Her mother has died, and she has come to live with her father. That is all anyone needs to know. Dr. Graham's expression registered surprise, then respect. As you wish, Your Grace. It's a bold choice, but perhaps the right one. After the doctor departed, Alexander found himself reluctant to leave the nursery. He settled into a chair near the cradle, watching the steady rise and fall of Rose's chest as she slept. Mrs. Winters entered with a tea tray, her practical nature reasserting itself after the shock of the previous night. You should rest, Your Grace. Mrs. Simmons will stay with the child. There's no need for you to keep vigil. I know, Alexander admitted, accepting the cup she offered. But I find I don't wish to leave her just yet. The housekeeper's stern features softened. She's a beautiful child. She'll bring life back to these old walls. Life and considerable chaos, I imagine, Alexander replied with a faint smile. I know nothing about raising a child, Mrs. Winters. Eleanor and I, we never had the chance to learn together. Pain flashed across the older woman's face at the mention of the late Duchess, whom she had loved like a daughter. You won't be alone in this, Your Grace. Every servant at Blackwood will help, and... She hesitated, then pressed on with her customary directness. The late Duchess would be glad, I think, to see joy return to your eyes, even if the circumstances are unexpected. Alexander looked up sharply, struck by the observation. Had joy returned to his eyes? He couldn't remember the last time he had felt anything but the dull weight of obligation, moving through each day because it was expected of him, not because life held any particular meaning. Yet since the moment he had held Rose, something had shifted. There was purpose now, and with it, a flutter of emotions he had thought permanently extinguished. I'll need to write to London, he said, his mind turning to practical matters. My solicitor will have to draw up papers legally acknowledging her as my child and heir. Mrs. Winters nearly dropped the teacup she was holding. Heir, Your Grace, but a female child cannot inherit the dukedom. No, but she can inherit everything else, the unentailed properties, the investments, my personal fortune. And while the title must pass to my cousin Henry upon my death, I can ensure Rose's future is secure. He set down his tea with new determination. I'll need to revise my will immediately. Of course, Your Grace. Mrs. Winters hesitated, then added gently, and have you considered what this means for other aspects of your future? Society will expect that you might eventually remarry to provide a male heir for the title. Alexander's jaw tightened. It was a question he had asked himself through the long hours of the night. The arrival of Rose altered the calculus of his grief-stricken vow never to remarry. As Duke, he had responsibilities that extended beyond his personal preferences. The title had been in the Harrington family for over 2 centuries. Could he really be the one to let it pass to a distant branch of the family? One change at a time, Mrs. Winters, he said finally. For now, my priority is ensuring Rose's well-being and place in this family. The rest will be determined in due course. The housekeeper nodded, recognizing the dismissal in his tone. She gathered the tea things and departed, leaving Alexander alone with his sleeping daughter. Rose stirred in her cradle, tiny eyelids fluttering open to reveal those startling blue eyes. For a moment she simply stared up at Alexander, her gaze uncannily focused for one so young. Then her small face crumpled, and a surprisingly powerful wail emerged from her tiny lungs. Alexander froze, momentarily panicked by the sound, before his instincts took over. He reached into the cradle and lifted Rose carefully, cradling her against his chest as he had seen Mrs. Simmons do earlier. "Shh, little one," he murmured, awkwardly patting her back. "You're safe now. You're home." The words felt strange on his tongue. This tiny being, unknown to him just hours ago, now represented home in a way that the grand, empty rooms of Blackwood Manor had failed to do since Eleanor's death. Rose continued to cry, unimpressed by his amateur efforts at comfort. Mrs. Simmons hurried in, alerted by the sound, and reached for the baby with experienced hands. "She's likely hungry, Your Grace. If you'll permit me." Alexander relinquished the child, watching as the wet nurse settled into a rocking chair with practiced ease. Rose's cries immediately ceased as she began to nurse. "You have good instincts with her, Your Grace," Mrs. Simmons observed. "Many gentlemen wouldn't know to pick up a crying infant, let alone hold her properly." Alexander shook his head, unconvinced. "I'm entirely out of my depth, Mrs. Simmons, but I'm willing to learn." "That's all any new parent can do," she replied with the wisdom of experience, "even those who've had 9 months to prepare." The simplicity of this observation struck Alexander forcefully. He was a new parent, thrust into the role without warning or preparation, yet wasn't that true in some measure for all parents? Eleanor would have had the same learning curve, the same moments of uncertainty, had fate allowed them their chance. As Rose's eyelids grew heavy again, Alexander found himself making a silent vow to the child who had so unexpectedly become his. He would not hide behind his title or responsibilities, delegating her care entirely to servants, as was common among the aristocracy. He would be present, involved, a true father, not merely in name, but in all the ways that mattered. "I'll need guidance," he told Mrs. Simmons quietly. "From you, from Mrs. Winters, from anyone who can help me understand how to care for her properly. I don't wish to be a distant figure in her life." The wet nurse's eyes widened slightly at this unconventional declaration, but she nodded with approval. "Children need love above all else, Your Grace. Everything else can be learned." "Love," Alexander repeated softly, the word both familiar and foreign on his lips. After months of feeling nothing but the hollow ache of loss, could he trust himself? To love again, to risk his heart on this tiny, vulnerable being who could be taken from him just as cruelly as Eleanor had been. Yet looking at Rose's peaceful, sleeping face, he realized the choice had already been made. From the moment he had lifted her from that rain-soaked basket, some dormant part of his heart had awakened. Whether he willed it or not, this child had already begun to wrap her tiny fingers around his soul. Later that afternoon, as sunlight finally broke through the clouds that had lingered since the storm, Alexander stood in the family chapel at the rear of the estate. Eleanor's memorial tablet gleamed in the soft light, filtering through stained glass, the marble still pristine white against the ancient stone walls. "We have a daughter," he said quietly, the words echoing in the empty chapel. "Not in the way we planned, not the child we dreamed of together, but a daughter nonetheless. I don't know if I'm equal to this task, Eleanor. I don't know if I can be what she needs without you beside me." Only silence answered him, yet as he stood there, a curious peace settled over him. Not the empty resignation that had characterized the past 18 months, but something warmer, more purposeful. "I'll tell her about you," he promised. "When she's old enough to understand, I'll make sure she knows about the remarkable woman who would have loved her without question, regardless of how she came to us." As Alexander turned to leave the chapel, A shaft of sunlight broke fully through the clouds, illuminating Eleanor's memorial in a wash of gold. It was merely a coincidence of timing and weather, he knew, yet he could not help but feel it was. Also a blessing of sorts, a benediction on the new chapter that had begun with a knock on a rain-drenched door. "Guess we're a family now," he whispered, echoing the words he had spoken to Rose the night before. And for the first time since he had laid Eleanor to rest, the word family felt not like a knife to his heart, but like a promise of healing.